Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Recovery Talk. I've had an absence due to some issues relating my physical health. I'm now in a bit of a better place, so I'm very much looking forward to getting started with posting podcast episodes again because it's been quite a few months now. And I really have been missing recording episodes, so I'm happy to get back on it with that. I will continue to try and post weekly, but then maybe sometimes twice a month instead. So what I wanted to talk about today is being in recovery versus being recovered, and that space in between, and the concerns of, oh my God, but is these things that I'm doing and feeling and thinking in recovery gonna be forever? So one thing I see a lot in people with eating disorders is that they want to jump from being, having an eating disorder straight into being recovered from an eating disorder, not acknowledging that there is this space in between called recovery. I like the metaphor of a bridge that is holding two separate places together. So in order to get from destination A to B, you are going to have to cross that bridge. And it may be a bridge that seems quite scary and unpredictable, but that is the bridge that you need to cross to get to the other side. In short, recovery is something you're going to have to go through, not around, in order to get your life back and start rebuilding yourself. And so many times I also have people come to me being very concerned because they are in recovery and they are, for example, eating a lot more, they're resting a lot more, and they're like, wait, this can't be healthy. And that's why I always remind them that how you are eating and moving in recovery is going to be different to how you are eating and moving when recovered. Think about it when you have an injury. Imagine you've broken your leg. You're probably going to have to go through a period of time where you are resting that leg. And the same thing goes for eating disorder recovery. You're not meant to be in perpetual recovery. You're meant to get your life back to start having a sense of normalization. But you're going to have to go through recovery first. I think the 4 R's here are very helpful to look at. So you're going to have to go through weight restoration. You're going to have to go through refeeding. If you're still undernourished and underweight, you can't necessarily expect to just jump straight back into, I'll just eat normal and see what happens. I mean, if you are someone where you have a solid level of appetite in recovery, leaning into intuitive eating maybe early on can work for you. But I see a lot of people where they're like, I'll just be normal. I'll just eat normal. But you're not in a normal situation. It will be like the person with the broken leg expecting themselves to just walk on the leg because everyone else is. And yes, of course, the person with the broken leg should not just avoid walking on that leg for the rest of their lives because once upon a time it was broken. They should eventually start actually walking on that leg, even though that feels scary and unknown. Just like how someone with an eating disorder shouldn't latch on to recovery forever and refuse to let go of recovery. But the thing is that you can't let go of recovery until it's over. If you're someone where you still are, you're under eating, you're not at your set point, you're still engaging in excessive movement, you can't necessarily let go of the treatment, right? I think that's why it's so important to have a realistic view of where you are. And if that is very, very hard for you, then of course working with a professional that can help you kind of figure out where you're at and what is best for you to do right now can be very, very helpful. Because what is the healthiest thing to do for someone who is, for example, in early eating disorder recovery? It's going to be different from someone who is, recovered or in late stages of recovery, or who don't or never had an eating disorder at all. This is something I always discuss with clients, especially when it comes to movement, when it comes to extreme hunger. So a typical thing I hear from clients is, but physical activity is good for us, which I say, yeah, of course it is, but who is us? Someone who's acutely undernourished, underweight, maybe be engaging in exercise with compulsion, disorderness, essentially eating disorder being the one taking the steering wheel, would be so much healthier just taking a step back and resting up. Yes, there will be a future version of you where exercise will be really great for your mental and physical health, but you're going to have to go through the recovery stages beforehand. And then gradually implement it when you are in the right mental and physical space to do so, and ideally doing so with a professional. I'll talk more about, resuming movement after an eating disorder in a future episode, but I just thought I'd mention that briefly already because that's one thing that comes up a lot. And so many times people have such a hard time giving up movement but it's healthy. And again, it's like thing of you're going to have to see where you are at with your mental and physical health. Because health is super individual. Going for walks is great, but it's not great if your leg is broken and the walking is preventing your leg from healing. I see a similar thing when it comes to extreme hunger, where people will say, Amalia, I am here eating cake and pizza for breakfast and I'm eating far more than anyone around me. This cannot be healthy long term. To which I'm saying, yeah, but it is not a long-term thing. That's the whole point of extreme hunger or reactive hunger. It is a temporary response to having been in an energetic deficit and something that will eventually resolve itself when you are refed, when your weight restored, and where you're not having these strict, rigid rules around food. Remember the point of reactive hunger. It is hunger that happens as a reaction to something. There are other reasons for elevated hunger, but reactive hunger is elevated hunger as a result of restriction and weight suppression. This does not mean that there is a future point where you're going to have to restrain your eating, not at all. Instead, it is a future point where you will notice that things start calming down. You start noticing that your cravings are shifting. You start noticing that your level of hunger is shifting, and suddenly it's not so extreme anymore. I hear this so many times when I work with clients who've gone through extreme hunger, and they will come to me and they'll be like, I craved a vegetable for the first time in weeks, maybe even months. This can be a very difficult area because sometimes people go through extreme hunger and then they end up with their appetite being actually quite low and food being quite boring. And it used to be so fun, so exciting, so tasty, just so rewarding. And now it's just like, whatever. Recovery is about trust. It's about trust that your body will figure it out if you let it. It is trusting your body that if you just give it the tools that it needs for healing, it will self-heal. I understand there is nuance here. I understand that, we know that complications can occur in recovery. We know that some people have other underlying health issues that can create some serious trust issues with the body. I get that. But in general, the wonderful thing with eating disorders is that our bodies are pretty good at when they get enough food and rest to actually heal. It is also trust in yourself. Trust that you will handle the challenges of recovery. Trust that you will get to a point where you aren't so fragile, where you aren't so vulnerable. This is a huge thing I see sometimes with people who are in the later stages of recovery. This does not apply to the people in earlier stages of recovery. I mean, it can, but a lot of times I see this more in the later stages of recovery where someone is so scared of kind of resuming interaction with the world again because they're like, geez, what if I get triggered? What if I relapse? What if I go to that dinner with my friends but they say something triggering, and what happens then? Will I just ruin my whole recovery? Or what if I start studying again and it's just too much? And I have so much compassion for this. It can be when you work so hard on your recovery, you kind of want to wrap it in a safe blanket, and you don't want the outer world to come and risk ruining all the work you've put in. But remember, you're doing recovery so that you can go out there, be resilient, and engage with the outer world. There, of course, is a point in early recovery where actually you may have to be a bit like, I'm not in a space to do full-time study right now. I'm too medically compressed. I'm too mentally not in the space for that. That is okay. But this is something I always work so much on with my clients because I love doing rediscovery work and kind of getting out there and resuming contact with the world after an eating disorder. This is part of the work. This is why you're doing this. It is important to be realistic with yourself about where you're at. Sometimes I see people where they are just in their eating disorder and they are refusing to take a break, refusing to pause, but they're actually at a point where that's exactly what they need. So a concept that I like to emphasize is the concept of know your tendencies. I tend to see two different groups of people with eating disorder recovery. The first one are people where they swing slightly more avoidant and may be very scared of doing anything that might compromise their recoveries, and that can again be the right thing in a very reasonable way of seeing things. But it can get to a point where they may feel so scared of engaging with the world because they're underestimating their own resilience and they are underestimating the strength of their recovery. Maybe because they've had a relapse before, so then they're thinking, well, the last time I started studying or the last time I started being more social, I fell backwards. So that means that this will happen again. And for those people, I always remind them, well, what is different now compared to back then? And then they may say stuff like, oh, well, back then, I wasn't properly weight restored. I still had so many restrictive thoughts. And then it's like, okay, yeah, see, things have changed. Then there is the other group that has a tendency of, what can I say, wanting to go from a 0 to 100. It's like they're just sitting there looking at their watch on when this whole recovery thing can be over so that they can jump straight back into all the things that they used to do. Maybe not properly investigating if the things they used to do contributed to the stress that created eating disorder. So instead of being overly scared of any potential stress or challenges, they are almost like scared of being scared of it. I know that sounds really strange, but they're like, I want to make sure I don't use recovery as an excuse. I want to make sure, again, it's like, I get that, but again, know your tendencies here. Do you have a tendency of holding back, of withdrawing, of avoiding, or do you have a tendency to be like, oh, okay, I'm going to do this, I'm going to jump into this, I'm going to go from 0 to 100, right? Knowing where you're at, knowing your tendencies is just so incredibly important. Maybe working 10 hours a day every day was overdoing a little bit. Maybe your career path as a cardio instructor was not sustainable with, remaining recovered. And it's fine to investigate some of those things as well. So know where you're at and know your tendencies. And this is, like I said it before, this is one of the areas where a good coach or a therapist or someone can help you investigating that a bit in yourself. Because like I said, people have a tendency of just looking at their watch, waiting for recovery to be over, or be terrified of, oh my God, am I just latching onto recovery and avoiding the world when they are literally in early recovery? They tend to be so scared that they instead belong to the opposite group. The group of people who maybe are holding on to recovery a bit longer than necessary. The people who maybe are a little bit overly cautious because they're so scared of relapsing. And there is no perfect answer of what to do, when you are in recovery, when are you recovered, all of these things that people want an answer to. It is super individual, but try and investigate your own resistance, your own urgency, not to mention looking at where you're at with the 4 R's. That can help you make an assessment. I also want to just make something very clear, and that is that, again, like I said, you don't have to go from a 0 to 100. For example, imagine you're someone where you want to, get back into work. Maybe you've taken some time off of work, or maybe you've been working reduced hours. You don't have to go, like I said, straight back into extreme high intensity. I understand that this is a bit tricky because some people don't have much choice. But if you have the privilege not to, going slow and steady and then seeing, okay, this was actually fine. Like I handled this. This was good for me. And then you can kind of find a volume that works for you. This is something I see or work on with clients when resuming exercise as well. They often can be a little bit scared, very understandably. Or they can be extremely urgent, like I need to go back into it now, I need to get back into now, which is a red flag. But for those who are more hesitant, it's like, okay, maybe you don't have to start like running every morning, right? Maybe you could instead start doing, for example, some gentle yoga, going to a yoga class, see how that works. Did you feel triggered? Did you find that, hey, this was actually quite nice? So people with eating disorders can sometimes have a tendency towards black and white thinking, where the thinking is not super flexible, where the thinking is very like extreme sometimes, where it's very like all or nothing, good or bad. And this is a very interesting thing because we're trying to figure out, okay, how come? Why is that? It seems like it can be an underlying personality trait that can predispose someone to develop an eating disorder, because you hear all of this diet culture information and you may have a tendency to take that literally and be very extreme with it. Whilst other people will hear it and kind of just brush it off and see the grace. Then again, we also know that being acutely undernourished or underweight can also influence your cognitive function and make you more rigid in your way of thinking, which is bad news because that fuels the eating disorder even more. So part of recovery is learning to be more flexible with your way of thinking. And I understand that this looks different for everyone, especially if you are autistic, which you know a lot of people with eating disorders, especially long-term anorexia, there are high rates of autism. Know that this can influence the person's way of thinking and engaging with information and absorbing the world, where things can be taken in the ways that maybe they weren't intended. This is also part why knowing your tendencies is so important. Do you have a tendency to take things very literally? Do you have a tendency to go to extremes? If so, how can you work around that, knowing yourself? So again, recovery is the bridge between having an eating disorder and being recovered. I understand it's not always so straightforward. I understand sometimes people they start walking on the bridge and then they start running back. Sometimes people walk on the bridge and then they just get stuck on the bridge. That's a metaphor for quasi-recovery, by the way. Or they may be scared of getting off the bridge because destination being fully recovered, that can seem like, oh my God, that comes with a lot of responsibilities and unpredictabilities. And oh my goodness, this feels so overwhelming. I can't do it. And the eating disorder feels safe and predictable. Or even recovery can sometimes feel safe and predictable. I remember for myself when I was in recovery, I did come to a point where I was like, recovery actually does feel quite nice and familiar. And this was actually quite nice when I was in recovery, because I was like, yeah, this doesn't feel as scary as it did in the beginning. And that's a huge strength, getting to that point in recovery. And I still remember how scary it was when I was in the later stages of recovery, where I didn't have much food rules, I didn't have much food anxieties, I was eating very freely, I was weight restored, all of the physical indicators of my eating disorder was gone, mentally as well. I wouldn't fit the diagnostic criteria for an eating disorder anymore. Yet I remember that it was really scary of letting go of some of these things. For example, starting to eat without a meal plan was really scary. Not having the same support that I had. And I will note on this, I do not necessarily think that when someone is, in later recovery or approaching recovery, they should just immediately be without support. I actually think that this is the time where people need support more than ever, because this is often the time where the person is starting, to quote unquote face the world again. They may again start resuming movement. They may find that because of their hunger has normalized, they're eating differently, their appetite has changed. If they have taken, a little bit of a step back from other things, such as, certain work or studies, they may find that this is the time where they start doing that again. And for some people that can be really triggering. For other people it can go very fine. I'm by no means suggesting that you're just like a little child who needs to be, your hand need to be held through this, right? This is not what I'm trying to say. I'm just saying that I would say that for people with eating disorders, this is a time where actually having a bit of support, that you can do it. You're resilient, you're able to handle these things, can be very, very helpful. So I remember part of me was scared. I was like, well, will I just end up going backwards now? And there always is a risk of that. Unfortunately, we do see that relapse risks are the highest a few months after someone has recovered. But it's like, what is the alternative? Maybe you have to take that risk. Maybe you have to take that risk and trust yourself that you will be fine. Because a lot of times when people do relapse, it is because they weren't 100% there, and then they go back into habit. They went back into an environment that maybe made them sick. For example, maybe they were in a really unhealthy relationship. Maybe they were in a job that caused them to burn out. So you do want to think a bit about these things. So from my own experience, I remember that part of me was scared. Part of me was scared that I wouldn't handle it. And I think I just saw re-engaging with adulthood and quote unquote adulting seemed really scary and overwhelming for me. And what I made an agreement with myself on was that I'm not going to feel like I need to have everything sorted just because now I'm recovered and I need to, now I need to run in, I need to buy a house, I need to get married, I need to do all of these things. I gave myself time to gradually re-implement and re-explore. I remember I got a part-time job at first, and then I was like, this was nice. And I think I got another part-time job. So I actually had 2 part-time jobs. That was quite nice. And I was like, actually, this is really good for me. Then eventually I started studying again. Eventually I moved abroad. I even started dating again, started being more social. I started doing all of these things that I avoided during my eating disorder because I was not in the right space to do it. Yes, I was in school during my eating disorder, but I was in special education, basically just white knuckling my way through it. And I kind of learned what spaces are good for me, what people are good for me. I learned that the hard way sometimes. and how much is too much for me? How can I build up my tolerance? But what's important, I did this by gradually moving out in the world. I did this very committed not to fall backwards and very aware of my own triggers and my own red flags. Aware, not hyper aware. Vigilant, yes, but not hyper vigilant. There is an in-between here. So please give yourself grace. Don't feel like you have to have everything sorted out because you're now quote unquote recovered or about to approach that destination. But equally, don't fear that destination. Don't avoid that destination because, oh my goodness, well, how much uncertainty, what am I going to have to do, what's going to be expected of me. You are recovering so that you can go out and engage with the world. But know your tendencies and know where you're at. Remind yourself of the differences between being in recovery versus recovered. And also could be helpful to keep in mind that there's a difference between being very early in recovery versus being in the end stages. It's not always a perfect linear thing, but it is something to keep in mind. Recovery is not meant to be your life forever. It is meant to be a temporary part of your life to get to the point where you don't need it anymore. And again, I do understand different people have different conceptions of recovery. So some people may say, hey, that's actually not really how I see it. For me, I consider myself to be in recovery from an eating disorder and have done so for 10 years. Just like some people, for example, people with alcoholism may consider themselves to be in recovery, even though they haven't been drinking for 10 years. So I just want to leave space for that this is just my way of using language and how I see it, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're wrong if you have a different way of seeing it. I just think that for me, it feels empowering to say that I'm actually recovered. For me, saying that I'm in recovery would feel very confusing. Because right now, I'm essentially living my life as someone who don't have an eating disorder. And I don't have an eating disorder. I don't fit any criteria for an eating disorder. And outside of my job, eating disorders and recovery is not really part of my life. But in order to get to where I am, I had to go through a time where recovery was basically my life. It was a full-time job, and I'm so grateful that I allowed myself to go through that stage in order to get to where I am now. If I hadn't allowed myself that, I wouldn't be where I am right now. I had to let myself go through a stage where I was eating so much food. I was not really moving my butt at all. That was okay. That was what I needed then. And I can still have times where I enjoy eating more than I usually would, or times where I am just taking it very easy. I mean, that's kind of me a lot of the time now. But it still is a different life than I was living back when I was in recovery. And that's okay because it's a different stage. What's healthy at one stage in your life versus another, it's gonna vary. And sometimes you're gonna have to go through a stage where maybe you're not eating the most nutritious diet. Maybe you're not gonna be the fastest runner. And that is okay, because that's what you need to get to what health is for you. So know your tendencies and know where you're at. Hope you guys enjoyed this episode, and I will see you guys very soon.